So Tara, I couldn't have said it better. It's, are your people challenged by the nature of the system? Is the system that you have probably designed getting in their way of accomplishing what you want them to accomplish? So you're not helping them accomplish what you want to accomplish because of the nature of your system. And then the greater the uncertainty, the more requirement for communication and buy-in. Tara, anything that you wanted to share about that? Did I get your perspective right? Have you seen it done well? Have you seen it done right? Like, yeah, where are you at right now?
Yeah, so I've seen it run the gamut. I think you're right. I often tell people, I'm a strategist at heart, and that's so much of what I've done, but I've also spent time in HR. The change that the initiative that I mentioned is one where I was sitting in heading up organization effectiveness and change management. So, I often get asked, well, if you're a strategist, what are you doing there? And the reality is that you can't execute strategy without people. Ergo, you can't ignore them ever. It's like ignore them at your peril. It's not going to work. So you're right in that assessment of it. It also, the one thing you said was it's not so much about the tactics, it's more about getting people engaged. Well, I think that's true. It's also because people in your organization at every level, tactical is a level of strategy. It's the ground floor level of strategy. It gets a bad rap. If somebody, it's like an insult if somebody says you're too tactical. And while you need to also be able to think bigger picture and understand all that, if you don't actually do anything, then you won't get anywhere. So tactics in and of themselves aren't a bad thing. That said, the key piece is being able to, and even at the ground floor level, is to connect the tactics, choosing the actions on the ground that you're doing that best get you to the destination. So in that example I gave you, and yes, it's a huge organization, but I was dealing with very small sites at times, and asking them, well, do you really want to have to spend 2 days figuring out how to pay these people that are on salary that you pay anyway? There's things like that where at the tactical level, what is it that you're doing right now that we could change? The other thing that you mentioned was the systemic piece of this, or the systems thinking approach. A lot of times you hear about that in terms of the interdependencies. And systems thinking is even broader, right? It's like all the various pieces that could be coming together. And it's kind of like a Venn diagram on steroids, right? Because a Venn diagram usually has 3 circles and then you try and get in the middle usually. Systemic and systems thinking could be umpteen versions of the Venn diagram, and you're trying to get the guy right in the center or see how that works. That's hard. Interdependencies, easier. So interdependencies come into play. I was working with a controller's shop in a pretty good sized organization, but still smaller mid-sized organization. And they were having trouble with time to close. A time to close in accounting, you think, who cares if it takes us too long? But the implication of that was that they couldn't support the decisions. They couldn't provide the financial data that they needed to support decisions that were happening in the moment. They were an investment firm, so they really were kind of real time. While there are long-term investments, they were also adjusting portfolios and things like that as they go. And this delay in the time to close meant that people were constantly taking decisions based on literally last month's data. Or they'd get all the way to the end of the month to get, the end of the next month to get their data. And at that point, they've already moved through, their world had shifted again and they couldn't take decisions. So closing it up, decreasing time to close had a really big business impact for them. And it required we mapped the process. We looked at, how all things were going, to look at the bottlenecks. But the key piece of that was interdependencies. The people who are contributing to the effort to close the books, which is like, making sure your expenses are in and, getting your revenue booked, all of those kinds of things that go into the numbers and generating them. They had no idea where they were in the process. They had no idea what their contribution was. They didn't know that the controller's shop was counting on them They were depending on them for very critical information. And I'm not talking about everything they were doing. Like, what are the critical things for which I depend on you? And then for what critical things do you depend on me? And those are your major interdependencies. Those are the things you have to attend to. And that's a tactical thing to do with huge impact on the bigger picture. So at the operational level of strategy, as well as potentially the highest enterprise level of strategy. And then once they figured that out, I asked them, well, have you asked them for it? And they went, no. And it's like, okay, so if they don't know the impact of their delayed reporting, in this case, how do you expect them to have any incentive to change? And then in the flip side happened too. You know, the controller shop was like, these guys have got to give us the number by this date or our whole process gets mucked up. So they went and talked to them and said, you guys need to give us this data by this date or we're hosed. We can't get this out. You're the problem. And those guys said, hang on. And if you ask the same questions, they said, we're dependent on this event to get you the data you need. So you asking for it by this time doesn't work. We will never meet that deadline. And the controller shop stood back and went, oh, hang on. So this is where your Venn diagram on steroids starts to go, right? So, you know, the controller shop had solved for the simple. And then talking to the next one, they're like, oh, hang on, there's another piece. And so they were able to restructure their timeline and their process in terms of how they were doing so that those guys no longer held them up. And those guys also were able to give them a different view that they could then quickly adjust if they needed to, if something else changed. But they were able to, they had to kind of rework both of their thoughts on that by having that same conversation. So it's two key questions and then make sure you actually, you know, get the answers to those two key questions. That's very granular.
No, I think it's so critical because as a leader who is trying to drive change forward, to recognize that it's not as simple as here's my plan, go do it. Because there are so many things that, you know, you change one input to the system that it's going to have an effect over here. And that I want to highlight again, the awareness or lack of awareness from each other party, because, and I'm sure you've seen this, is that you're like, this person just never does what I ask them to. Or this person isn't working with me. And so it goes back to those fiefdoms. It's like you want to have that like collaborative organization. We all want to work together, but nobody actually takes the time to look at like, hey, what's happening in this person's world? Like, how can I help them help me? But it's like we're so busy trying to like move stuff forward. Like, I've got all these deliverables. I just need to worry about my deliverables. But if you actually take the step back, which is the value of the strategy, and to say, okay, like, how do all of these interdependencies look? And how can we, you know, streamline it? How can we make it work? How, like, what is the system that this requires to move strategy forward? So when we talk about, you know, strategy for real is not just making a plan and executing it. Strategy for real is understanding the human side of what's needed, the fact that, you know, you don't operate in a silo, even in the best of cases, and that then you have like emotions and human people parts of that, which is a whole other kettle of fish. As we start to wrap up again, if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat. What would you say, I want to ask, where have you seen strategy go really poorly on any of your consulting engagements? But what would you say is something that you saw, you're like, man, either I missed the mark or they missed the mark, and that was just like, I don't want to ever do that again as it relates to strategy execution?
So I think, and this is likely kind of obvious, or at least in terms of why I even kind of started a business called Strategy for Real and focusing on that aspect of it. But it's sort of the blind adherence to a set of steps, tactics, action items. Like, just get on the train, keep going, stay on the track, and we don't move. You know, there's never a problem in the track. If there's a problem in the track, you like move it out of the way and keep going. I mean, or plow through it if needed. I think that's the biggest piece. That and a failure. So it's like you just did it visually. Like I'm in there, I'm doing my own thing. It's like traveling with blinders on through the whole thing. It's one thing to narrow your focus in times of uncertainty. It's another thing completely to put blinders on as to what's going on around you. And just to be really clear, that's a huge distinction. And I think the strategy mostly goes wrong when that happens. Give you an example. I had a client I was working with, and at the very beginning of an engagement, I often will say, okay, so and I was hired by the CEO, this guy was not the CEO. And, so very often it's like, what does success look like for you? What do you see as success in this engagement, success in this strategy? What does that look like? It's a conversation I often have at the beginning with each person. And, I literally got a binder. You pulled it off the shelf. It looks like this. And then everybody doing this. And I looked at him, and I don't know if anybody on the call is familiar with Dr. Phil. Like him or not, one of the things that Dr. Phil does that is just beautiful is, with a totally straight face, in light of the most ludicrous, absurd things, he will look at somebody and say, how's that going for you? And the reality is, if it's not going for you so well, maybe you ought to change something. And I think, there is a bit of, this was the situation. It's like, that wasn't going so well for you. Blind adherence, you're behind on this, you're behind on that. We're not getting where you need to be. And, you need to make a huge change in your organization. So you're facing a big threat. So that's not going to work. And that happened periodically throughout in that engagement with different people. And it wasn't just about the strategy. There was, if your market has changed, which means you can't build, literally, they were people who built, the company that built stuff. You can't build exactly the same thing, even though it takes years to build stuff. So your timeline to when you can actually bring things online is really hard. I saw that a lot early in the US, and actually it was happening around the world too, in a shift to combined cycle gas turbines and stuff in the utility sector. And that happened all over the world. In the US, the financing is a little different than it is in some of the other countries. And the point is that, irrespective of what that looks like, they're planning for, we think there's going to be a bigger gas future here. However, they've got to take decisions about this new thing, new technology, new way of going, and big, huge plants and facilities, 10, 15 years in advance of when things are going to be brought online. And so the further out that timeline is, the harder it is, because you really do have a blueprint. And a blueprint, I talk about the distinction in my work between offering a blueprint, and what I do is bring frameworks because they move. When you're building something, you got to use the blueprint. And let's face it, I'm glad when the guy building my house followed the blueprint to the letter. Yeah, that's good, right? They've got to still figure out, is this still the right investment to make? And how do we time it? And what adjustments do we make? Do we need to change out some of our coal? Do we need to make it a combination one? Is there some other way? What flexibility or what options can we build into that right now, where at various intervals, which we've marked, there could be decisions or gates or, timelines or something. Will we reevaluate, and can we still make changes? So a lot of folks in big projects will talk about a go, no-go decision. Those happen multiple times. And that's a great process, by the way, is kind of stop letting it and saying, are we ready to go to the next phase? You can see that in product development. You can see that in just any kind of a new launch of something when they're trying to roll something new out. If you do a go, no go at each point, or are people with you, the questions that you ask to make that decision are different, but it's the same idea.